Spring 1223. On a flat, glassy morning of low green and wide sky, a dark band appears on the horizon. 20,000 horsemen like a moving shadow, no carts, no pack animals, no cumbersome baggage trailing behind them. They race across the steppe with a speed that should be impossible for an army. Columns that break apart and reunite, scouts vanishing like wind, entire detachments covering distances local commanders assumed were unattainable. The local magistrates who watched this approaching wave did not ask first about tactics or armor. They asked the only question that mattered to commanders in the Middle Ages. Where is their food? That question is the hinge of everything that follows. In the comfortable imagination of towns and fortified places across Eurasia, an army is a city on the move, an animal of carts and wagons, of grain bags and forage parties, dependent on roads, markets, and long, vulnerable supply chains. And yet here is a force that seems to invalidate that basic premise. How did they keep men and horses fed? How did they move so fast for so long without the long logistical tail every military manual of the age took for granted? If you love surprising history, hit subscribe. To answer that riddle, we have to change the unit of analysis. Instead of asking how an army was fed, ask what an army actually was. For the Mongols, the primary resource was not wheat on a cart. It was grass under the horses' hooves. Theirs was an economy of mobility, sunlight captured in blades, transformed by grazing animals, converted into milk, meat, and endurance. The entire logistical system, organization, diet, tactics, flowed from an ecosystem. Put another way, while sedentary states built logistics around roads and stores, the Mongol military built logistics around a living, moving pasture. The first step is to appreciate what conventional logistics meant in the 13th century. A European or Chinese field army marching with its siege engines needed grain and fodder. A rough guide from contemporary accounts places the daily needs for a mixed medieval force: soldiers, draft animals, pack animals at large quantities. A single horse often required several pounds of fodder a day if it wasn't on fresh pasture. A human soldier needed a steady supply of grain or bread. Because towns and fortified granaries were not always available, commanders relied on a tail: wagons carrying grain, teams of oxen, a corps of sutlers and camp followers. That tail was heavy, slow, and utterly vulnerable. On a good road, a wagon might average 10 to 20 miles a day. In bad conditions, it sank to a few miles. Roads, bridges, and the safety of supply corridors dictated strategy. Armies moved where supply allowed, not simply where generals wished. Contrast that with the mobility reported of Mongol contingents. Contemporary and later accounts, some written by observers, others by chroniclers who compiled testimony, describe their detachments covering dozens of miles in a single day during pursuit or raid. Some sources give striking figures, ranges like 60 to 100 miles a day for short bursts, and more conservative sustained averages around 20 to 30 miles per day for extended marches. But we should treat these numbers as ranges, conditioned by terrain and purpose. The key point is qualitative. Mongol units routinely operated at speeds that left conventional field forces baffled. Why did that happen? The simple, unsettling answer is that the Mongol system converted the landscape itself into a supply network. Grass is a form of stored solar energy. Horses graze it, convert carbohydrates into mobility, and then humans can tap that conversion. That taps a chain of biological efficiencies and cultural habits that European armies, rooted in grain and carts, simply did not exploit to the same degree. Start with the animals at the center of the system: Mongolian horses. They were not the enormous destriers of medieval Western lore. They were smaller, tougher, bred for a harsh landscape. That morphology gave them critical advantages. Their bodies used forage highly efficiently. They could subsist on sparse steppe grass, browse on shrubs in winter, and recover on a thin diet where heavier horses would falter. Far from being a liability, their size and metabolism were an adaptation to a resource-poor environment, and that made them perfect living fuel tanks for long-range operations. But the story is not just about transportation, it is about nutrition. A mounted warrior did not carry 3 weeks of hard rations in his saddle because he did not have to. Instead, he carried his food in the form of animals and products that were lightweight, durable, and aligned with a nomadic way of life. Fermented mare's milk, erag or kumis in different sources, played a central role. A mare produces copious quantities of milk during lactation, and nomadic herdsmen had refined processes for collecting, fermenting, and storing it. Fermentation extends shelf life and changes the milk into a beverage that is more easily transported and tolerated, delivering calories, proteins, and hydration, often sufficient to sustain a warrior on the move when fresh grain or cooked meals were unavailable. Iraq deserves more careful framing because it is the single most evocative image in many narratives about steppe logistics. Later chroniclers and some contemporary observers described armies pressing on while drinking from saddle bowls or passing goatskin flasks of fermented milk. Marco Polo and other travelers mentioned it, though always filtered through their own cultural lenses. More local sources, some of them oral traditions later written down, highlight how integral mares were to mobile subsistence. A man who could ride and milk his herd had a food source that moved with him, yet it's important to be cautious. Sources vary in how much they emphasize milk as the primary diet of soldiers versus its role as a supplement. Some accounts may romanticize the image of lean horsemen sustained on a steady diet of milk alone. The reasonable reading is more modest. Erag was a crucial, reliable supplement, especially on campaign, but not the only food consumed. When fermented milk was insufficient, the Mongol repertoire included several lightweight preserved foods. Kurut, dried curds made from milk, was compact, long-lasting, and calorie-dense. Men could tuck pieces into saddlebags. Kurut didn't spoil the way fresh dairy did. Borts, strips of dried meat, provided another resilient protein source. These goods were similar in function to jerky and hard curd cheeses found in many pastoralist societies. Small, durable packages of concentrated nutrition that travel well on a horse. They are often mentioned in passing by chroniclers, but archaeologists and comparative ethnographers confirm their presence across the steppe in later centuries. It is reasonable to assume similar practices in the earlier period, though precise inventories or proportions remain uncertain. There are, in addition, more dramatic emergency practices that require sensitive handling. Numerous accounts describe Mongol riders resorting occasionally to drinking horse blood. This practice shocked contemporary sedentary observers and later readers alike, and it is often the most sensational detail recounted to explain Mongol endurance. Properly contextualized, however, it appears as a pragmatic, limited response measure. When food was exhausted and survival was at stake, a rider could nick a horse's vein, collect a small amount of blood, and recover the animal soon after. Some descriptions emphasize that the wound was minor, that the animal would survive and heal, and that the practice was used as a last resort rather than routine. We must be careful here. Sources differ on frequency and method, and moralizing about cruelty distorts a picture that, in context, is about material necessity under extreme conditions. Present-day readers should neither romanticize nor sensationalize it. Treat it as a historical tactic deployed under pressure, reported by several observers, but not necessarily the backbone of daily logistics. A further point of resilience was the multiple horse system. Records and ethnographic parallels suggest that a warrior did not fight on one horse alone. Each man typically kept several mounts. Some sources indicate 2 to 4, while others imply more. These horses were rotated, one for combat, another to ride at a comfortable gait. a spare kept fresh for the next day. This simple habit multiplied the effective daily range of a rider, because individual horses could rest and recover while others bore the brunt of a march or a charge. More subtly, every additional mount was both transport and nutrition. A horse could be slaughtered in extremis for meat or provide milk if it was a mare. The presence of extra horses meant a mobile force could postpone dependence on static supply depots, trading time and grazing for sustained movement. Combine those biological and cultural elements, and you uncover a logistics logic radically different from that of settled states. Instead of building a supply chain of carts and warehouses, Mongol units decentralized sustenance. The steppe formed a dispersed pantry, detachments scattered to graze, then reassembled for combat. That dispersion was not a weakness. On the contrary, it was a deliberate technique that turned the environmental constraints into an operational advantage. A conventional army, tied to a wagon train, presented a single large target. Mongol detachments, small and dispersed, were harder to pin down. They also created the illusion of numbers, as detachments converged from multiple directions. And crucially, access to grazing determined movement more than roads or markets. In effect, the steppe itself became a supply network of living, renewing biomass. We must also attend to the role of hunting and shepherding. Mongol campaigns typically did not abandon pastoral practices. Tents carried by some families provided the continuity of camp life. Herds accompanied many detachments, especially in prolonged campaigns. Hunters and small foraging parties supplemented preserved foods with fresh meat when opportunities arose. Unlike the wagon-borne logistics of sedentary armies, this approach invested in resilience through mobility. Bring the animals with you, or move in such a way that you can feed them along the way. All of this was organized and amplified by cultural norms and administrative innovations. The Mongol military was not a loose band of marauders. It was a highly ordered force. The decimal system, Arban, Jagan, Mingan, Tuman, created modular units that could operate independently and recombine as needed. By structuring the army into self-contained subunits, commanders ensured that each element had a measure of internal sustainability. A 10-man group could split and graze. A 100-man contingent could form a temporary camp with its own livestock. That local self-sufficiency, multiplied across many units, produced the strategic effect of a large army without a correspondingly large supply train. It is crucial to differentiate this decentralized sustenance from the yam, the relay system. The yam provided fast communication, posts where riders could exchange messages, fresh mounts waiting at intervals. It is sometimes tempting to conflate the yam with a supply chain, but they serve different functions. Where the yam connected decision-makers and allowed directives to traverse massive distances quickly, the nourishment of the force depended on local grazing, preserved stores, and the mobility of livestock. The yam moved information, the grass moved calories. Equally important was intelligence and pre-campaign planning. Nomadic commanders and scouts possessed intimate knowledge of water sources, seasonal pasture, and the rhythms of the landscape. Contemporary observers, Master Roger among them in some accounts, describe Mongol reconnaissance as meticulous, scouts probing ahead, mapping routes, avoiding exhausted pastures. That might seem like common sense, but it implies another layer of logistics, planning movements to coincide with available pasture, reserving areas for future grazing, and timing marches so horse recovery aligned with tactical needs. In some instances, the Mongols appear to have staged their marches to arrive at contestable territory when local forage was still available, thereby complicating defenders' calculations. If this sounds abstract, it's useful to anchor the argument in a concrete image. Imagine a warrior unit of 100 men crossing a patchwork of steppe, each man riding 2 or 3 horses, each horse grazing as soon as the column pauses. Instead of unloading sacks of grain, the unit sends small teams to salt mines of grass and water, while others stand ready to reconnoiter or fight. Each man carries the equivalent of several days' nutrition in compressed form, kurut tucked away, small pouches of dried meat, a goat skin of fermented milk. The unit can move days longer without a resupply convoy because its sustenance is not a tail but a distributed living system. This arrangement produces operational effects that are easy to underappreciate. First, speed. A force not tied to a train can use tempo as a weapon, moving quickly, striking unexpectedly, and then withdrawing into dispersed grazing patterns that frustrate pursuit. Second, endurance. By rotating horses and tapping milk and preserved foods, Mongol units could sustain operations over wide distances and harsher intervals than a wagon-bound host could. Third, flexibility in theater choice. Where a traditional army needed to anchor itself to a road or river for supply, Mongol forces could operate across plains, through mountain passes, or along river corridors, so long as grazing and water were adequate. But none of this means limitless invulnerability. The very strengths of the system also reveal its limits. The dependence on grass and grazing makes a pastoral logistics model highly contingent on environment and season. When the steppe gives way to marshes, dense forests, tropical jungle, or a maritime theatre, the advantages shrink. In the winter or in drought, if pasture is exhausted, the system strains. The Great Invasion of Hungary in 1241-42, for example, is often read as a demonstration of Mongol military supremacy. Yet the withdrawal and the campaign's eventual trajectory also illustrate environmental constraints. Heavy rains, marshy plains, and colder-than-expected conditions complicated forage, movement, and local resupply. Likewise, campaigns in the humid tropics of Vietnam or the maritime challenge of Japan exposed the mismatch between a horse-centric logistics system and environments that did not support it. Before we move to specific campaigns, it's worth pausing over a set of practical numbers that help make the contrast visible. A typical medieval wagon, with its draft animals and crew, might sustain an army's needs for a limited distance each day, 10 to 20 miles on decent roads. A Mongol raiding column, relying largely on its animals and on-the-spot pasture, could achieve far higher short-term speeds when exploiting the open steppe. Contemporary accounts sometimes report bursts, 60 to 100 miles in a day, during forced marches or fast pursuit, though these should be read as exceptional sprints rather than daily averages. Over longer campaigns, a realistic sustained daily rate would fall into a lower range. Horses need rest, water, and time to graze. The lesson is not numerical precision so much as a relative gap, a mobility advantage measured in multiples, not merely in a few extra miles. So far, we have set the conceptual frame. We have looked at horses as living engines, at milk and preserved foods as portable nutrition, at emergency measures like blood drinking as conditional survival tactics, and at the modular organization that allowed small units to operate independently. We have contrasted this with the familiar image of supply trains and dependent camps. What remains is to see how these elements translate into battlefield practice, how logistics, mobility, and organization coalesce into tactics and decisive outcomes. There is one early, telling episode that exemplifies the link between logistics and combat decisions. Spring 1223, near the Kala River. A force under a commander often named in sources as Subday rode into contact with a much larger coalition. The details of the encounter are material for close reconstruction: pursuit, feigned retreat, dispersion of enemy formations, converging detachments. But at its core, the action reveals an operational logic. A lighter, faster force can choose the time and place of engagement, dissolve into the landscape when unprofitable, and reunite to strike with concentration. The logistical choices, The ability to feed horses in dispersed patterns, to rotate mounts, to carry minimal preserved rations, are not background conditions. They are the infrastructure of strategy. A general who can force an opponent to react to 1,000 ephemeral points of pressure will win not because of superior numbers in armor, but because his supply model denies the enemy the clean tactical options that come from controlling lines of communication and resupply. But before following the route from Kala River to a full analysis of Hungarian and East Asian campaigns, we need to finish the technical picture. The next step is to examine in greater detail the biology of horses and the precise composition of nomadic foodstuffs, how much energy a mare's milk actually supplies, how kurut is prepared and compacted, how bortz compares to European preserved meat, and then to trace how these consumption patterns shaped daily routines on campaign. Only after that can we fully map the transfer from logistics to battlefield success, and then lay bare the moments where the system fails. At this junction, the story begins to hinge on data that sits at the intersection of ethnography, chronicler testimony, and practical calculation. It is here, in the small numbers and the habitual practices, that the abstract claim, "they survived without food supplies," either becomes convincing or collapses into myth. We will examine those details closely. The caloric output of mare's milk, the carrying capacities of riders, the typical number of horses per man, and the practicalities of meat and curd preservation on the move. Then we will move to the field, how those calculations played out at Kala River and elsewhere, and what they tell us about the larger strategic lesson. But before jumping ahead, one more thing must be underscored. This was not a naively simplistic system. It required deliberate choices, disciplined routines, and cultural structures that made mobility a way of life. The Mongol army did not invent mobility out of a vacuum. It institutionalized a set of pastoral practices into military doctrine. In doing so, it forced the rest of Eurasia to confront a different logic of logistics, one where the landscape feeds the spear, where tent and herd travel with the warrior, and where speed, not mass, becomes the decisive currency. That transformation of pastoral habit into military doctrine, of grass into supply, will be the subject of the next section. We will crunch the numbers on milk and meat, look at the mechanics of horse rotation, and then move from these everyday practices into the decisive maneuvers that made the Mongol army seem, to contemporaries, like a force that could live off the land in ways others could not. We begin with the small, stubborn figures that make the whole system believable. Put bluntly, to understand how the Mongol army survived without food supplies, you must see how a few liters of milk, a handful of dried curds, and a rotated string of horses add up into months of movement. Numbers rarely lie, but they do need context. Where sources disagree, I'll give ranges. Where historians debate frequency, I'll mark it as reported or suggested. The point is not to pretend exact precision, but to show plausibility. First, mares and milk. A lactating mare is not a milk factory like a dairy cow, but she is productive enough to matter. Ethnographic parallels from later pastoralists and scattered medieval notes indicate that a milking mare can yield several liters a day during peak lactation. Some pastoralists report daily yields in the single digits of liters. In favorable conditions and with frequent milking, production can be higher. Fermentation, turning fresh mare's milk into ayrag or kumis, was central because it extended the drink's usefulness, improved digestibility for adults unused to raw mare's milk, and, crucially, made the liquid less perishable on campaign. Fermentation also alters taste and nutrient availability, and it can slightly increase caloric availability through microbial action. Contemporary travelers mention ayrag as both a beverage and a field ration, both for hydration and for calories. How much could a unit realistically draw from mares? Imagine a 100-man contingent in which a portion of mounts are mares and a portion are geldings or stallions saved for fighting. If even a modest fraction of horses were milk producers, the unit could collect tens of liters of milk per day, enough to supplement calories and, importantly, to provide fluid and quick nutrition. Fermented milk would be shared from small containers, passed among riders during pauses. It is not plausible that milk alone sustained all exertions for prolonged periods. Rather, it was a reliable on-demand supplement that reduced dependence on stored grain and allowed for longer marches between contact with fortified supplies. Next, preserved foods. Kurut, dried hardened curds, and borts, dried strips of meat, are the portable pantry of pastoralists. Kurut concentrates milk solids into dense, shelf-stable lumps that resist spoilage. Borts concentrates meat into low-moisture strips that keep for weeks in a dry climate. Both are compact and calorie-dense relative to their weight. A rider could carry small pouchfuls of kurut and borts without saddling extra burden, and those pouches could supply concentrated energy when moving through areas where grazing or hunting was temporarily scarce. Ethnographic comparison makes their existence and utility almost certain, even where medieval inventories are silent. Archaeological finds and later accounts show these products persisted across steppe cultures. Emergency measures sit at the edge of moral discomfort and logistical realism, horse blood. Multiple contemporary and near-contemporary observers describe isolated instances where riders drew a small quantity of blood from a mount to stave off starvation. The accounts should be treated carefully. They generally frame the practice as a last-ditch measure, not a daily habit. Descriptions emphasize small incisions, rapid recovery of the animal, and the extraordinary circumstances prompting the act: forced marches, blockaded foraging, or sudden inability to reach pasture. Biologically, fresh blood offers protein, iron, and fluids. Culturally, the practice is pragmatic rather than gratuitously brutal. Given the sensitivity of the material, and given the variation in sources, the safest reading is that blood drinking was available as an emergency survival technique, and that it was known to and reported by outsiders with a mix of horror and fascination. Horse rotation is the pragmatic linchpin. If one horse must carry a man through a 10-hour march day, the horse will fatigue, suffer, and lose condition. Rotated among several animals, the cumulative distance covered by a man increases dramatically. Sources vary on numbers. 2 to 4 horses per warrior is a conservative median in many reconstructions. Other testimonies imply larger ratios, perhaps 5 or more, when campaigns intended long-range raiding were anticipated. Even a rotation of 2 mounts doubles the range possibilities compared to a single mount. 3 mounts offers still more resilience. Each spare horse is both a transport asset and a biological reserve. Potential milk, meat, or, in extremis, blood. This redundancy is where pastoralism converts into logistics. Men do not merely ride animals, they manage a mobile herd whose productivity can be tapped on demand. Carry capacity and personal stores matter too. A mounted warrior's comfortable load is modest: a few kilograms of dried curd, several strips of dried meat, a small container of arag, and perhaps a pouch of grain or millet if available. Compared to a wagon train, this looks paltry, but it is a deliberate trade: less weight, more speed, and a diet sourced from the moving ecosystem rather than a dependent tail. On balance, a rider carrying a week's worth of concentrated rations in compressed form can bridge gaps between grazing opportunities, and the overall system is less fragile than a wagon-bound reliance on roads and heartlands. When you assemble these elements into a working model, the result looks like this. A force of several thousand men disperses in peacetime and pauses on campaign to let horses graze. When forced to concentrate for battle, they do so rapidly because every unit has its own means of subsistence. Scouts find the water and the pasture. Commanders time marches to minimize exhausted forage. In contact operations, speed is a resource. A detached, fast-moving unit can run down slower foes or collapse on a target and break contact before a supply-dependent defender can mobilize wagons and convoys. The Mongol army's structure made this possible. It was a distributed living network of calories and transport, not a single, easily targeted, logistically dependent organism. That theoretical model becomes concrete in battle narratives, and few episodes illustrate it more clearly than the Karla River engagement in 1223. Contemporary reports and later chroniclers sketch a scene of asymmetric mobility and psychological pressure. Subday, commanding a relatively small Mongol detachment, deliberately used speed, dispersion, and concealment to bait a larger coalition force into fracturing its own cohesion. The Mongols scattered to feed and reconnoiter. They used feigned retreats, an old nomadic tactic, to draw enemies into pursuit over broken ground and into predetermined killing zones. As enemy columns lengthened and scouts lost contact, Mongol detachments reunited at speed from multiple directions, executing envelopments and striking where the coalition's supply and command links were weakest. Three features of the Karla River action deserve emphasis. First, the feigned retreat works only if the retreating force can move faster and sustain that movement, both materially and psychologically. Mongol mounts and the rotation system supplied the material capacity. A culture trained in staged withdrawal ensured discipline under fire. Second, dispersion as a feeding tactic made it harder for a large, settled force to bring collective pressure to bear. Chase one group across the steppe, and another simply disappears over the horizon. Third, psychological shock compounded material advantages. Opponents who expected a neat line of battle were forced into reactive skirmishing, losing formation and command cohesion. Logistics is often invisible in narratives of courage and tactics, but in Karla River it is the silent protagonist. The Mongol ability to feed and rotate mounts made those maneuvers feasible. If Karla River is a success case, Hungary in 1241–42 is the canonical cautionary tale. That campaign began with tremendous operational momentum. Mongol detachments swept into Eastern Europe with speed and ruthlessness, routing armies and seizing territory. Yet the later stages and the campaign's aftermath reveal how ecological mismatch undermines a locomotion-based logistics model. The Hungarian plain, subject to heavy rains and seasonal marshiness, presented forage and terrain challenges not present on the open steppe. Worse, the European theatre offered long stretches where settled agriculture had already consumed available pasture near population centres, and rivers and marshes limited where horses could graze and move. Contemporaries, such as some Western chroniclers, describe boggy ground and swollen rivers that impeded cavalry, limited the mobility advantage, and exposed detachments to attrition when horses could not recuperate properly. Master Roger of howsoever transmitted sources, Hungarian observers and later chroniclers, recorded the strain of prolonged campaigning in these conditions. Horses downgrading in condition under unfamiliar forage, supply improvisations stretched thin, and the logistical elasticity that works on steppe grasslands showing its seams. Tactical victories on the field could not translate automatically into extended occupation when the environmental balance tipped. The Mongol system was not broken in Hungary. Rather, it encountered an ecological context in which its natural advantages were blunted. Heavy rains turned grazing into mud, marshy terrain funneled movement and reduced dispersal options. Supply improvisations could not be maintained indefinitely at extended distances from home pastures. The East Asian campaigns underscore the same principle from another angle. Japan and Vietnam are often cited as failed theaters for Mongol arms, and the reasons are not simply stormy weather or logistical negligence. Japan required maritime projection and resupply across the sea. Ships, ports, and coastal supply infrastructure were necessary, and the Mongol reliance on horse movement could not be transposed to an island-hopping context. Storms and typhoons, events outside any logistician's control, compounded the difficulty. In Vietnam, dense jungle, seasonal monsoons, and humid conditions limited cavalry operations. Pasture was patchy or absent, and tropical disease and logistics of feeding large contingents far from home eroded Mongol advantages. In both regions, the pastoral, horse-centered supply model ran into ecosystems that did not sustain it. The horses could not feed, the terrain reduced speed, and the logistical improvisations that worked on open grasslands proved inadequate. This is not to suggest that the Mongol model had no adaptive capacity. Where necessary and possible, they used local fodder, purchased or seized grain, and requisitioned supplies. On some Central Asian and Chinese campaigns, the Mongols integrated conquered or allied pastoral communities, used local markets, and adapted thinly to agricultural provisioning. But the core advantage, turning the landscape itself into a moving supply by relying on grazing animals, was context-dependent. Where that context was absent, the system's costs rose precipitously. A careful account must also recognize the role of communication and administration. The yam and the decimal system were complementary but distinct. The yam established fast lines of message transmission via relays of mounts and riders at fixed posts. News, orders, and reports could cross the empire with speed. It is essential to say this loudly. The yam was not a cargo train. Fresh horses at relay stations enabled quick message transmission but did not carry preserved bulk provisions for entire units. The decimal organization, the Arban, Jagan, Mingan, Tuman, on the other hand, embedded a level of internal resourcing and command that made dispersion feasible. Each subunit had a predictable size, internal logistics, and command responsibility. When necessary, these units could act semi-independently to find pasture or concentrate for battle. The combination of decentralized sustenance and centralized communication produced a force that could move fast and still be oriented strategically. Another dimension often overlooked is pre-campaign intelligence. Mongol scouts were not random wanderers. They were skilled surveyors of pasture and water. There are reports, some cited by chroniclers, others inferred by historians, that Mongol planners timed campaigns to seasons and pathways where pasture would remain available, reserved key water sources for future need, and avoided known pasture-depleted tracts. This is not mystical foresight. It is attentive planning rooted in generations of pastoral knowledge. A campaign that ignores the seasonal cycle of grass is doomed. One that observes it gains a multiplier effect on endurance. Nomadic societies develop calendars of pasture, memory of springs and wells, and institutionalize practices to preserve grazing, knowledge that translates directly into military advantage. The broader strategic lesson is straightforward and remains relevant. Logistics define strategy, and logistics are ecological. The Mongols did not defy logistics so much as redefine it for their ecological context. If conventional military thinking equates logistical sophistication with wagons, granaries, and depots, the Mongol example shows that sophistication can also be harnessing living systems, pastures, and animals as distributed supply. Where the environment aligns with the system, the apparent simplicity, horses and grass, yields extraordinary operational effects. Where it does not, the same simplicity becomes brittle. That existential lesson has modern echoes because the underlying logic is universal. One relevant parallel is entrepreneurship. Small, agile teams that align their operating model to the constraints of their environment can outperform larger, better-funded organizations that are burdened with heavy infrastructure. A startup that optimizes for speed and flexible resources can outmaneuver a corporation weighed down by legacy costs. Another analogy is military doctrine. Guerrilla forces that rely on local resupply and mobility can be effective in certain theaters against conventionally supplied armies. A third is energy systems. Decentralized, renewable sources perform best when they match local conditions, while centralized systems require heavy infrastructure and supply chains. These parallels are conceptual, not literal. Grass is not a renewable energy grid, and a mare's milk cannot be boxed into corporate metaphors without losing its specificity. But the meta point endures. Fit logistics to environment, and you gain leverage. Returning from analogy to blunt history, the central question posed at the start, where is their food, can now be answered with clarity. It was not a single place. It was distributed under hooves and in saddlebags. It was fermented milk in skins and compact curds in small pouches. It was the nutrition embedded in multiple mounts and the capability to draw on those mounts when necessary. The Mongol army's food was, quite literally, mobile. That mobility replaced the heavy tail of wagons with a lighter, living system that moved where the grass allowed. This is why smaller units could disperse, why fast raids could be maintained, and why, in environments friendly to the model, the Mongol armies sustained operational tempos that baffled their contemporaries. At the same time, the answer must be honest about limits. Where pasture failed, so did the edge it conferred. Where the theatre required sea lanes or dense jungle traversal, horses could not create grazing. Where settled agriculture had denuded nearby pasture, or where seasonal weather turned grass into mud and marsh, the logistical elasticity contracted and required alternative provisioning or withdrawal. History records both the breathtaking successes and the sober constraints. Finally, consider the human element. Practices that sound alien, fermented mare's milk, temporary bloodletting, must be read in cultural context. For nomadic societies, animal management, milk processing and mobile herding were ordinary skills, not exoticities. Contemporary observers often framed these practices with moral or emotional coloring, astonishment, disgust, admiration, but the core reality is practical. These were adaptive techniques honed over generations. The Mongol army's logistical artistry was not a trick of genius alone. It was an institutionalization of pastoral lifeways into military doctrine. So when we reface the question with the certainty the evidence allows, the response is this. The Mongol army's food was part of its movement. It rode on grass, carried in compressed dairy and meat, and relied on multi-horse management and disciplined dispersion to turn the steppe itself into a supply network. The plain under their horses' hooves was both highway and pantry. If this reframing matters to you, tell me in the comments which modern example fits this pattern. A small, adaptable system beating a larger, infrastructure-heavy competitor. Was it a startup, a military campaign, a social movement? I'd love to read your comparisons. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into how logistics can transform strategy, subscribe for more history that looks beneath the battle and asks the quieter question, how did they keep going?